Our first reading is a reflection on the way that the sacred life force, or call it God, or spirit, or love, is present in and around us, in the earth, in our flesh, and in our connections with one another. For me, this short reading is a really beautiful way of thinking about resurrection, that irrepressible force that surely must have been in Jesus, and the ways in which his love and power was available and persist even now to us long after his physical death. This is Rising Up, Springtime Moving Again by Anna Bladel. In places where the ground freezes in winter and thaws in the spring, mud has its own season. Water cannot percolate the frozen depths, so the surface layers of soil become saturated and turn to mud. In Ukraine, there are Russian tanks that have gotten stuck in the mud, unable to advance. A tiny resistance, the earth enacting a blessed refusal. On the verge of the Buddha's enlightenment, he touched the ground and asked the earth to bear witness to his awakening, and it is said that flowers sprang up where his hand touched the dirt. God and world, inseparable, embracing, divinity dispersed through the world, the aliveness of sacred life force incarnating the flesh of the world, dirt, mud, ash, earth, ground, the elemental stuff of creation and creativity. We are of earth and stars and sunlight and spring rain and ocean depths and galactic goodness, getting stuck and springing forth, each nurturing something of precious. I'll start again with there we go. The reading from Luke. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the child of humanity must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." Then the women remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and all of the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to the apostles an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. You could hear the whole room gasp. And then we held our collective breath. Down the length of this long room, a wheelchair came sailing at top speed, reached the end, made a quick and perilous turn, and flew back down to the other side. In it was a woman with the smile the likes of which I'd hardly ever seen, a woman who herself could not see or speak or walk. Her wheelchair was pushed way past the speed limit by one of our children. And standing on top of the wheelchair, with bare feet balanced precariously on the narrow arms, legs straddling the other's upper body, and arms fully extended, looking like Rose in the movie Titanic when she exclaimed, "I'm flying," was one of our dancers. It felt in that moment that Nellie Green and Lisa Lovelace had caught the wind beneath their wings and could sail forever. How many people were in the room on that day? It all began with the church auction. Who knows how many critical moments in history can be traced back to a humble church auction? Like so many of us who, when the auction rolls around each year, wonder what on earth we could possibly have to offer this year that could be of value to someone else. Our deacon then, the Reverend Eleanor Green, or Nellie, as she was fondly called, must have asked herself the same question: what can I give the auction this year? 20 years before that, Nellie had been a student in the program which prepared people to serve as deacons in the Episcopal Church. She had already done graduate and postgraduate work in theology and was now following what she understood deep in her bones to be God's call to ministry. As part of her preparation for ordination, she met a United Methodist pastor and Bible scholar who had been tasked with teaching Bible for that program. At the time, he had just been appointed to a small and dying congregation, and they needed to decide and discern whether the best course of action was to celebrate its past, give it a fitting funeral and close the doors, or see if there might be some seeds of potential new life hiding beneath the soil. That church was this church. That pastor was Hal Tausig, and there were seeds. They were nurtured into life. There was resurrection. And along the way, and as part of its rising from the ashes, was a woman who had persistently and stubbornly refused to quit when the deck was so stacked against her. A woman who, at 18 years of age, was in a near-fatal car accident on her way to her first week of college that should have killed her, but she didn't die. Following a diagnosis of extensive and permanent brain damage, legal blindness, limited mobility, and ultimately the loss of her ability to walk or use anything but one or two fingers to communicate, and no verbal speech, Nellie Green wouldn't quit. She went on to educate herself, live independently, get ordained, break all the rules, and follow God's call to ministry, which led her here to be on our pastoral staff for 21 years. You may notice that we have a habit of keeping people for a long time. So Kip, be forewarned. And you might want to remind Priscilla, too, before that ordination. Everyone said no. Everyone but God and Nellie. And if you asked whether it was advisable for a woman to stand on top of a wheelchair without a net which carried another woman with no ability to control it, pushed by a child at top speed with many sharp edges in the room, everyone would have said no again. Everyone but God and Nellie. And it started with that church auction. Nellie's offering that year was to write a poem for the highest bidder. Lisa Lovelace, a long-time church member and one of our dancers, was the recipient. But Lisa didn't want just any poem about God or nature or the world. Lisa asked if Nellie would write something about her own life and her own experience. And the final product was a poem entitled "I Am" by Nellie, which began, "What determines being human? Is it thinking? I think, therefore I am. These words pose a dilemma for me because I have extensive brain damage as a result of an automobile accident. Fortunately, my mind wasn't harmed, but what is the mind without the body?" And her poem goes on, "I am woman with partial sight, but whole vision, in my little craft caught in a storm, pitching and weaving on baptismal water, holding fast to my rudder, which appears to be God." Together, Lisa and Nellie choreographed that dance. It was not only dramatic and sometimes terrifying, it was heartbreakingly tender as they wove their legs together to take a few steps. and Lisa sat in the wheelchair and cradled Nellie on her lap. On Easter morning that year, 15 years ago this morning, the headline on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer read, "Nellie Green had it all. Then tragedy took away her every dream, but she found her calling, which led her to a personal resurrection." A journalist had been in worship that morning. They saw Lisa and Nellie dance and heard Nellie's poem, and Nellie's story was shared with the world. In another poem by another fierce soul, American poet, feminist, and political activist Muriel Rukeyser, she builds in the poem to this question: what would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open. What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? It's what Nellie did. Told the truth about what it was like to feel trapped in a body over which she had little or no control. The truth about feeling, as she described it, paralyzed in the devil's spider web. And she told the truth about her life in God, being held and guided and not alone. She told the truth, and the world split open. The women who loved Jesus and went to attend to his physical body after he was put to death, they went with tenderness, with love, and with rituals, and with oils, and with spices, and then they told the truth about what they experienced, what they found, the fact that Jesus' body was not in the tomb, and the world split open. But before it did, if we look closely at the story, we notice that they were not believed. A recent post from @ProphetPop captures that biblical account in a tweet. Women: "Yo, Jesus ain't in the grave." Men: "Whatever." Women: "I'm telling you, I was just there. He got up. I literally just talked to him." Men: "Show me." Women: "Come on, let's go look." Men: "Everybody look, I've discovered Jesus is alive." Some things have not changed. How many of us have told our truths and not been believed? How many of us have told our truths, and once other people see what you told them, they take all the credit? Have you experienced this? Maybe you were trying to tell somebody your truth about the way you work, the way you love, your gender, your identity. Maybe something wasn't right in your family and you were trying to tell somebody. Or maybe something in your relationship wasn't working and you tried to communicate it. Maybe you were a woman in a workplace in a world dominated by men, or a person living in a body that this world was not built to accommodate. People who are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islanders, and immigrants have been telling their truth for 400 years. But so many of us who are white have not heard it. Or, once the veil was lifted, finally ran around like Peter and the other guys saying, "Hey, everybody, look, this thing is happening. You won't even believe it." Maybe you're somebody who's tried to tell us that something is broken, that you're not okay, or that we're not paying attention to the right things. And if that's the case in this place, in this church, if I've been like Peter and haven't heard, I want to say I'm sorry. Maybe you're someone who hasn't told your truth yet because you're not sure you'll be believed or that it will be safe to do it. I wonder what it was like for those women in the midst of their unfathomable grief to find that the body of their beloved teacher was gone. And the confusion of learning that now he would be present to them in some kind of whole new way. The world split open, not just for them, but that shattering has reverberated throughout the world for the last 2,000 years. Jesus keeps rising in those who tell their truth and testify to the realities of a beautiful and broken world. Jesus rises in you, no matter how big or little or old or young you are, every time you tell your truth, and also every time the world makes it hard to do it. Jesus rose then and rises still. There have been so many times when people in this community have told their truth, testified, as the saints of the church would call it, and our world together here has split open like it did when Nellie and Lisa came sailing across this room. I'll never forget Maya Rector standing in the pulpit right down there. We met together, Maya and I, once a week for about a month or so. Maya would talk, and I would record and then transcribe everything she said, and then send her the text. She had agreed to preach for our church. But writing a sermon is tough. I know we make it look really easy, but it's tough, even for seasoned clergy. And she was a 17-year-old high school senior, struggling to keep up with her schoolwork and apply to colleges. So we cooked up a plan where she could tell me about the things that mattered to her, and then I would I would send her her words, and she could organize them later. Maya, you taught me something about what it can mean to create and hold space for someone's story. Your sermon, Maya's sermon, how many people were here on that day? Yeah? Yes. Mom, I know you were here. That's right. Maya's sermon is one of the highlights of my time in this community. She talked about her journey to say yes to herself, and I checked this with her. She talked about her journey to say yes to herself in a world that so often denied or rejected her. She talked about being Black and about being lesbian, about living with bipolar depression, and about what it was like to be in deep despair. She also talked about her commitments to justice and her resolve to learning to speak her truth. She testified to the powerful role of this church in her life, sitting on the steps like all the other little kids. I believe that God says yes to us, she preached. We should do the same. Let me run that by you just one more time. Maya said, I believe that God says yes to us. We should do the same. One woman, one young brave woman told the truth about her life, and our world split open. Maya, Nellie, countless children, you saw just a tiny fraction of them over the years that have sat on those steps and gave us this truth straight and unfiltered. They've asked questions that matter to them. They've told us what they need us to know. Our time with children is not a parade of cuteness. It's not a performative demonstration of how cool we are here. It's a time when we support and bear witness to our children learning to come to speech and speak their truth. And just as importantly, it's an opportunity for those of us who are grown-ups to practice every single week listening and believing someone else's truth, even when their truth challenges us or interrupts us. I remember when Alden Coe-Doyle interrupted me, smack dab in the middle of a sermon I worked hard to prepare and deliver. Thank you very much. You were probably 5 or 6 years old. In the United Church of Christ, we say, God is still speaking. Well, God spoke that morning in the middle of my sermon in the voice of a 5-year-old who was open enough to spirit, engaged completely in a sermon that should have bored the daylights out of him, and trusting enough in this space and these people to use his voice and ask a question. I don't know if that sermon needed a course correction, as so many of my sermons have, or if you were calling BS, or if we just needed to go deeper. I don't remember. I just remember that you put it out there, and we had a conversation. And that's what it means when we say God is still speaking, and Jesus keeps on rising. This place is nothing if not a resurrection community, a church that has witnessed and experienced rising, a ragtag group of people who stand on the shoulders of a few folks. Just imagine this. A few folks 175 years ago who had an idea that maybe a couple of us could get together, and support each other on our spiritual journey. And talk together and learn about the Bible together and pray together. 175 years ago, some people in this place said, I wonder if we should think about getting together and doing that. And 175 years later, and hundreds of people we stand on the shoulders of who made this space possible, made our life possible, made our resources possible, gave their life and their love and their prayers so that we could be here today. This church has been a place where Alden could interrupt and Maya could preach and Nellie could soar. This church has known what Anna Bladel describes as getting stuck and springing forth, nurturing something of precious aliveness and companioning each other into vibrancy. That's, for me, resurrection, when one person tells the truth about their life and the world splits open. When we get stuck and spring forth again, that's what it means to be people of faith. When we're interrupted, God is still speaking. And when we allow ourselves to be pushed, to carry, to sail, to fly without a net into the unknown, we're companioning each other into vibrancy. And over and over and over again, as it has for 2,000 years and 175 years, something rises. This is God's good news. Amen.